The first corruption. Elena Brightwater waited in the pre-dawn darkness outside the royal archives, her back pressed against cold stone that still held the night's chill. She'd been there for hours, watching the entrance with the kind of vigilance that came from knowing exactly what waited inside those doors. Not physical danger, but something far worse. The kind of knowledge that changed a person fundamentally, that carved away pieces of their soul with each page turned. She knew the moment Cassian emerged, not because she heard the door, the archives were warded for silence, but because the air itself seemed to shift, growing heavier with a wrongness that made her skin crawl. The door opened soundlessly, and Cassian stepped through. Elena's breath caught. He looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. His face was drawn, pale skin almost translucent in the dim light of the magical torches that lined the corridor. But it was his eyes that made her stomach drop. They held a darkness that hadn't been there before, a shadow that seemed to move independently of the flickering torchlight. Dark veins traced delicate patterns beneath the skin at his temples, barely visible but unmistakably present. "Cassian," she breathed, pushing off from the wall. He stopped, seeming to see her for the first time despite her vigil. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Shame, perhaps, or regret before it hardened into grim determination. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough as if he'd been screaming or chanting. "Neither should you." She moved closer, studying the changes in him with growing alarm. The shadow in his eyes wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something deeper, something that looked back at her with alien awareness. "What did you do?" "What I had to." He started walking, his stride unsteady. Elena fell into step beside him, close enough to catch him if he stumbled. "The texts, Elena, they're worse than I imagined, and more necessary." They walked in silence through the palace corridors, moving from the ancient sections toward the more modern wings where electric lights hummed softly and security cameras tracked their progress. Cassian kept one hand on the wall, as if the physical contact helped ground him. "Tell me," Elena said finally. Cassian stopped at a window overlooking the city. Dawn was breaking over Thornhaven, painting the glass towers in shades of gold and amber. But even from here, Elena could see the flicker of failing wards, protective sigils that guttered like dying candles. "Anathema-class magic works by making the practitioner both source and cost," Cassian said, his voice distant. "Conventional magic draws power from the ley lines, from the ambient magical energy of the world. That's why it feeds the Voidweaver. Every spell cast adds to the debt, strengthens the very thing we're trying to fight." He pressed his palm against the glass, and Elena saw the dark veins extend down his wrist, pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match his heartbeat. But forbidden magic, it burns the caster's own essence. Their soul, their humanity, their very being becomes the fuel. There's no external debt, no energy for the Voidweaver to consume. It's the only way to strike at it without making it stronger. "And the cost?" Elena asked, though she already knew. "Everything." Cassian turned to face her, and in the growing light she could see the changes more clearly. The shadow in his eyes had depth to it, like looking into a well that had no bottom. The first casting creates a permanent soul bond. It marks you, changes you. Each subsequent use becomes easier and more tempting, but accelerates the corruption. Eventually, he gestured back toward the archives, toward the sealed chamber with its blackened skeleton. Eventually, there's nothing left that's human. Elena reached out and took his hand, ignoring the wrongness that pulsed beneath his skin. "Then we make sure you don't have to use it more than absolutely necessary. We find another way, or there is no other way." Cassian's grip tightened, almost painful. "I spent all night reading accounts from the original sealing. Do you know how many mages it took to imprison the Voidweaver 3 centuries ago? 73. Every High Magister in the kingdom and dozens of lesser practitioners, all channeling anathema-class workings simultaneously. And do you know how many survived the process?" Elena shook her head, dreading the answer. 5. 5 mages lived long enough to see the sealing complete, and they were so corrupted that they had to be contained, locked away in chambers deep beneath the palace, fed and cared for like dangerous animals until the corruption finally consumed them. He pulled his hand away, wrapping his arms around himself as if cold. That's what saved the kingdom, Elena. 73 people who willingly became monsters so that everyone else could survive. And now we have maybe a fortnight before the wards fail completely. We don't have 73 High Magisters. We barely have a dozen who could attempt such magic, and most of them would refuse on principle. So you'll do it alone, Elena said, understanding flooding through her with sick certainty. You'll take on a burden that required 73 mages before. I have to try. Cassian's voice cracked. Someone has to try. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, sharp and purposeful. They both turned to see High Inquisitor Mordain approaching, his black robes seeming to absorb the morning light. His eyes locked onto Cassian with an intensity that made Elena want to step between them. Magister Netherbane, Mordain said, stopping a careful distance away. You've been in the archives all night. It wasn't a question. Yes, Cassian said, meeting the Inquisitor's gaze without flinching. The shadow in his eyes seemed to deepen. Archmage Verena granted me access. Did she? Mordain's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. And what did you learn in Section 7, subsection 12? The specificity of the reference made Elena's blood run cold. Mordain knew exactly which texts Cassian had been reading. Had probably known before Cassian even entered the archives. I learned, Cassian said carefully, that desperate times have historically called for desperate measures. Indeed they have. Mordain stepped closer, studying Cassian's face with clinical detachment. I also see that you've learned more than theory. Elena saw Cassian's jaw tighten, saw him fight the urge to touch his temples where the dark veins traced their corrupted patterns. The texts included practical demonstrations, Cassian admitted. Small workings to understand the fundamental mechanics. Small workings, Mordain repeated. Tell me, Magister, what does a small working of anathema-class magic entail? Cassian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I created a void flame, a candle-sized manifestation of pure corruption that burns without consuming physical fuel. It lasted 30 seconds before I dismissed it. And in those 30 seconds, Mordain said, you felt it, didn't you? The power, the ease of it. The way it answered to your will more readily than any conventional spell you've ever cast. Cassian nodded slowly. That's the trap, Mordain continued, his voice taking on an almost gentle quality. The reason anathema-class magic is forbidden isn't just because of what it does to the caster. It's because it feels right, natural, like coming home to a place you didn't know you'd been missing. He glanced at Elena, then back to Cassian. I won't arrest you, Magister Netherbane. Not yet. The king has ordered all available magisters to research solutions to the ward failures, and you are, technically, following that order. But understand this. The moment you use such magic outside the controlled environment of study, the moment you take it into the field against the Void Weaver or its spawn, you become my responsibility, and I will do my duty, regardless of the necessity that drove you to it. I understand, Cassian said. Do you? Mordain stepped even closer, close enough that Elena could smell the faint scent of incense that clung to his robes. Because I don't think you do. Not yet. You've read the histories, seen the warnings, even cast your first forbidden spell, but you still think of yourself as Cassian Netherbane, promising young mage with a bright future. You still believe, deep down, that you can use this power and remain who you are. He reached out and touched Cassian's temple, right where the dark veins pulsed beneath the skin. Cassian flinched, but didn't pull away. You're already changing, Mordain said softly. Already becoming something else. The question isn't whether you'll lose yourself. That's inevitable the moment you use that first working. The question is how much of the kingdom you can save before there's nothing left of Cassian Netherbane but corruption and hunger. He dropped his hand and stepped back. The council reconvenes at sunset. The king will ask if anyone has found an alternative to forbidden magic. You will remain silent unless directly questioned, and you will not volunteer the knowledge you've gained. Is that clear? Crystal, Cassian said. Mordain nodded once, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded entirely. Elena waited until she was certain he was gone before speaking. He knows what you're going to do. He's practically given you permission as long as you maintain deniability. He's given me rope, Cassian corrected. Whether I use it to save the kingdom or hang myself remains to be seen. He turned back to the window, watching as the sun climbed higher over Thornhaven. The city was waking up, subway trains rumbling beneath the streets, early morning traffic beginning to flow, people starting their days with no idea how close they were to annihilation. I need to practice, Cassian said. Need to master the basics before attempting anything against the Void Weaver itself. The archives have a warded chamber, sealed and shielded, where historical demonstrations were conducted. Verina's access includes permission to use it. Then I'm coming with you, Elena said. No, Cassian shook his head. You've already risked too much by... I'm coming with you, Elena repeated, her voice hard as steel. Someone needs to watch, to remember who you were before this started. Someone needs to be there to pull you back if you go too far. And if I can't be pulled back, Elena met his shadowed gaze without flinching, then someone needs to be there to do what's necessary. The weight of her words hung between them. She was offering to be his anchor and his executioner, his support and his end. It was the kind of loyalty that went beyond friendship, beyond duty, into something far more profound and terrible. Thank you, Cassian whispered. They stood together at the window, watching the sun rise over a city that had no idea how much darkness was gathering in its defense. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, the Shadowvale wastes pulsed with corrupt energy. And somewhere beneath them, imprisoned but growing stronger with each passing hour, the Void Weaver stirred. It had felt Cassian's first working, that small void flame that burned for 30 seconds, had tasted the familiar signature of corruption magic, the same power that had sealed it away 3 centuries ago. And it recognized what was being forged. A weapon made of the same substance as itself, a mage walking willingly into darkness. The Void Weaver had waited 300 years. It could wait a little longer. Because when the time came, when Cassian Netherbane finally stood before it wielding the full power of anathema-class magic, the entity would have a choice to make. Destroy the weapon that threatened it, or welcome it home. After all, corruption recognized its own.